Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, May 13th, and we have a whole lot of NBA playoffs to dive into from the previous weekend. We also had the NBA draft lottery that we're probably going to be touching more so on tomorrow because we also had the MLB debut of pitching phenom Paul Skenes, and I want to give some thoughts. He made his debut on Saturday, so I want to dive into that as well. So, going to be starting off by talking about the Denver Nuggets, evening up the series against the Minnesota Timberwolves. But before we get into the content of the show today, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Remember, for our live viewers, to use the comment section, give us your thoughts on the latest happening on sports, make this show as interactive as possible, and if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. Like I said, though, I want to start off the show today by talking about the Denver Nuggets, who seemed like everybody in the national media was counting out after dropping both of their home games to start off this series against the Minnesota Timberwolves. I understand the Timberwolves are this very exciting young team. Anthony Edwards seems like he is poised to be potentially the next face of the NBA, but a lot of people were calling for the sweep and saying that the Nuggets had no choice. Now, what I will say is that Jamal Murray definitely did not look healthy headed into this weekend, which was a real concern. But even myself, who had faith in the Nuggets coming into this series, I didn't rule them out, but I did do a little exercise on Friday talking about this was on Thursday, talking about what the playoffs and this reputation would sort of do to the Denver Nuggets if they were to drop this series badly. And now we see what happens when a true championship team gets backed into a corner. They respond. And we know that Jokic is always going to be great. That is just a given at this point. But it was the others stepping up. Like I mentioned, Jamal Murray. It was really concerning, his level of play coming into these past couple of games. We saw him basically throwing a tantrum in Game 2 based off of the whole throwing the heat pack situation, constantly yelling at the referees, and he was just entirely uncomfortable during the first couple games in this series, and he comes back and he looked very comfortable. He hit some ridiculous shots in this game. That was a nice response, but it wasn't just him. We saw Aaron Gordon running the offense for Denver, especially in some of those non-Jokic minutes that we'll be getting to shortly here as well. I think that the development of Justin Holiday, who was basically out of the rotation for that series against the Lakers, averaged just 7 minutes per game. He's come in and made a big impact for them. He shot 10 of 16 from 3 so far in this series, playing 19 minutes per game. He's pretty much taken over those Peyton Watson minutes, and I like Watson a lot because of some of the defensive intensity that he brings, but Holiday is scoring right now and making a very big impact for this Nuggets team as they destroy the Timberwolves in Game 3, and then last night was Game 4. They win that one 115-107. But we have just seen this Denver Nuggets offense that we obviously know has been tremendous over the past couple of years. They are facing one of the best defenses we've seen in the NBA in recent history with the Timberwolves, but the way that they were sort of able to recollect themselves after dropping those first couple games and respond the way that they have has been massive. I was specifically impressed with the way that at times it seemed like the pace they were playing at. We've seen Minnesota try and send these full court pressures at the Nuggets coming up the court. That's specifically how I think that Jamal Murray was knocked off of his game a little bit in those first couple games in Denver, but he's come back. I thought that he and Aaron Gordon as well, there was one possession as well where he was inbounding and he took it all the way up himself, and both he and Murray in a couple of these instances were able to beat their defender off the initial move, get them sort of behind them, and then create a numbers mismatch, generating looks for themselves and their teammates at the rim. So kind of using this Minnesota intense defensive pressure against them in order to get some looks for themselves. And again, these were in some non-Jokic minutes that I just was really blown away by the adjustment that the Nuggets have made in these situations. And I do think that they have sort of taken advantage of these full court presses in a different way as well. The fact that the Wolves are kind of just hurting themselves. There were some really stupid fouls from Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns, and Naz Reid. They're three big men that get the most playing time. It was just absurd to me to see on a few instances these guys, whether it was at the half-court line or in the backcourt, picking up these dumb fouls, trying to press Jokic all the way up the court. And it was just mind-boggling to me. And there was this one instance, it was literally 2 minutes into the game, Rudy Gobert ended up getting a blocking foul against Jokic right at the half-court line just about in that corner. And Reggie Miller was praising Gobert for the type of intensity and pressure he was trying to put against Jokic. But I don't know. I feel like I would prefer to have my number one defender not in foul trouble. And we saw Gobert end up dealing with foul trouble late in this game. He was dealing with 5 by the end of this. And I believe that played a role as to why he wasn't able to be quite as aggressive against Jokic in particular. And we saw Jokic being able to take Naz Reid in the post by himself a lot down the stretch because Gobert wasn't available quite as much. Now, offensive limitations definitely played a role in that as well, which we will get to later in this segment. But I just think that a lot of the times we see the Timberwolves just getting in their own way. And for as promising as they are, and I don't think that they are going anywhere in terms of, falling out of the playoffs, whether it's this season and they make a potential finals run or going forward here, this is going to be a Minnesota team that should be prominent for the foreseeable future. And we've talked about this at length on the show prior, talking about Karl Anthony Towns specifically and some of his fouling tendencies that drive me crazy personally, but his whole team just sort of not being able to get out of their own way. And another instance of these self-inflicted wounds was the end of the first half in this Game 4 matchup where, the Timberwolves were being outplayed pretty much the entire first half. Anthony Edwards was the only one who really had offense going for himself. There was that stretch at the beginning of the second quarter where we saw these non-Jokic minutes actually, in favor of the Nuggets, where they outscored the Timberwolves 12-2 in those first couple minutes with Jokic on the bench, which is something that we haven't seen from the Nuggets all year, really be able to hold themselves together with Jokic on the bench. But all that considered, it's a 7-point game with 30 seconds left. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope knocks down a 3, sort of so be it, that'll happen. But now it's a 10-point game. It seems like, okay, you can sort of keep this together, potentially even with the final possession, make it a single-digit game, and instead you have Anthony Edwards start his drive maybe a tad early, but he ends up turning the ball over. Nuggets run the court, get Michael Porter Jr. a dunk for another 2, and then Nickeil Alexander-Walker at that point just concede the half again, but he just whips the ball all the way up the court. Bad pass, Murray steals it, and then knocks down that 55-footer from the half-court line. Pretty funny moment there, him sort of celebrating with the announcers in that moment. And at that point, it just seemed like this was going to be the Nuggets game. And I believe it was because of some of these mental mistakes from the Timberwolves. So, like I sort of alluded to earlier, the level of offensive production outside of Anthony Edwards is definitely a concern for the Timberwolves. Edwards is tremendous. He ends up scoring 44 points in this game, 16 of 25 from the field, 5 of 8 from 3. But like I said, early on in this game, it was clear that he was basically going to have to do everything for them. And it's because the likes of Karl Anthony Towns was just unable to get the job done. He missed his first 7 shots, was 1 of 10, and he got himself going at least a little bit early in that third quarter, but just a fall off from the first 2 games to what we've seen in the past couple. And it is concerning because they really do need him to produce offensively. They don't have necessarily a third scorer, because you look at who is technically their third option. Gobert has been their third leading scorer in the postseason so far, in large part, at least if you look at last night, because of the fact that the Nuggets aren't afraid to foul him down the stretch and sort of take points away. Gobert was fine from the free throw line. I believe he finished 5 of 9, if I can double check myself here on the fly. Yeah, 5 of 9. So able to at least get his numbers up a little bit. He finishes with 11. And, outside of that, we know he and Jaden McDaniels are both limited offensively. Naz Reid is a good option off the bench, their 4th leading scorer, and early on it seemed like he was going to be the option for them. He comes in, immediately hits a 3. In the second quarter, he got himself to the rim a handful of times for some dunks and layups, but he only ends up taking 6 shots in this game. And we saw, again, like I mentioned, on the defensive side, Jokic was just so unafraid of him in that post-up matchup. So this is where we really need to see Towns be able to come out and be an impact player for this team. I still think that he can be. We know it, but the level of consistency with him can just be really frustrating because he is such a great offensive talent, and we've seen some of these steps in terms of his maturity to understand playing the team game more. But maybe it's an example of this team just being, I wouldn't even call it slightly ahead of schedule. I would say that this would be ahead of schedule definitively if it weren't for the fact that they went in and traded everything they did for Rudy Gobert. The front office sort of sped up the timeline a little bit. Now, Anthony Edwards still just 22 years old. Towns as well. I want to say that he's 26, 27 years old. So it's not like this team, like I mentioned, I think they are going to be prominent for the next handful of years, and I'm not concerned about their future necessarily, but there is just a little bit to this whole idea of, I don't know if they are necessarily ready to dethrone the champs. And on the Nuggets side of this, I mean, they were not good these first couple games, and yeah, you can somewhat blame it on Jamal Murray not being fully healthy, but even still, Jokic seemed, at least in game 1, like a more human version of himself. They've gotten massive performances from Aaron Gordon over the past couple games where, like I mentioned, he is with the ball in his hands, making decisions. He's knocking down threes as well. That is massive for them because they need to be able to find a way to get Rudy Gobert off of the court. And I actually thought that Gobert had a couple instances last night, at least, where he was on the perimeter playing defense against Jamal Murray and actually holding up for himself. But again, it's this idea of, we saw pretty much all year, and even going back to last postseason, if you will, that baseline play where Jokic has it in the post, and if he's one-on-one, he's going to take it himself, and if the help defender comes, Aaron Gordon is sort of hanging out right on that baseline for the lobs, and they don't necessarily have that same opportunity because of the fact that Minnesota has so much size between Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. Now that Gordon is able to space himself out a little bit more, and I know that game 2 was ugly. It definitely wasn't Gordon's best game himself either. But that was another game where he came out in the first quarter and he knocked down a couple threes for himself, and it seemed like that was maybe something to build off of. Now, again, that was Jamal Murray was completely taken out of that game, but we are seeing some real signs of improvement here for Denver that they are who we thought they were initially. And I know that it is very easy to get caught up in all of the drama and of, again, this exciting young team that I think most NBA fans are rooting for. And to some degree, everybody is sort of anti-champion. Now, I really enjoy the brand of basketball the Nuggets play, so I have a little bit of rooting interest for them. I might have also put a little bit of money on them after they lost game 1. So I have a little bit of an invested interest in the Nuggets coming out to win this as well. But I think that ultimately, I wouldn't say the series is over by any means for Minnesota. They need to sort of settle themselves down, especially on that defensive end, because they're not going to win the offensive shootouts with Denver. We saw in the last couple games when Denver's offense is really firing on all cylinders, Timberwolves just don't necessarily have that same firepower to match the Timberwolves. So, I guess I kind of hated how I was leaning with the Timberwolves after game 2, because how can you not really, as it's now being sort of publicized. There have been only 5 times in NBA history a team has come back from down 0-2 after dropping both games at home. I actually went in and I found those exact 5 examples. We mentioned this before on the show. It was the Clippers over the Mavericks in 2021. It was the Celtics over the Bulls in 2017. 2005, it was the Rockets over the Mavericks. 1994, the Rockets over the Suns. And 1993, the Suns over the Lakers in actually a 5-game series. So they had to win 3 straight games, couldn't afford to lose. So maybe I'll have to go back at some point and sort of more deeply analyze those specific series to see if we can discover some sort of pattern here. But I think that ultimately here, the Nuggets are a team that are more than capable of pulling off the odds. We saw in 2021 them able to, or it was 2020, off the top of my head I'm blanking a little bit, but I want to say it was the bubble playoffs where they came back from multiple 3-1 deficits in order to move on in the playoffs. So we know that this team has championship pedigree, and they are able to not necessarily, I feel like they were kind of sleepwalking a little bit through the beginning of the playoffs, and in large part it had to do with the fact that Jamal Murray was dealing with these injuries, but they seem to be back. Last kind of note here, very, very small, but I did notice at the end of the game that the Nuggets decided to run with Christian Brown in those closing minutes instead of Michael Porter Jr. MPJ briefly got subbed in at the end in order to be on the court in case there was an intentional foul situation and there were free throws on the line, but it was Brown who was in the game, and I think most specifically it was to try and play defense against Anthony Edwards. He forced a missed layup with about a minute left, so something that caught my eye. Curious whether that does develop into anything bigger, but ultimately, we got an even series here. This is coming back to Denver with a chance to take the series lead once again. But let me know in the comment section what your thoughts on the rest of this series are. We're going to be taking our first break right now, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the other series that we saw get evened up over the weekend, where the New York Knicks dropped 2 consecutive to the Indiana Pacers as they continue to deal with these injuries and the fatigue. So I want to touch on that. But first, a quick break. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, mind. Stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Now going to be talking about the series between the Indiana Pacers and the New York Knicks as we saw them tie it up over the weekend. It seemed like the Knicks had a great chance to really take control of this series on Friday. They were playing a close one against the Pacers. Tie game with 30 seconds left, and Andrew Nembhard hit an unbelievable shot. Now, definitely feels like a letdown spot here for the Knicks because on one hand, absolutely that type of a shot from Nembhard is a 1 in 20 shot to actually fall. But even still, they had actually forced a stop right prior to that. Tyrese Halliburton missed a three-pointer. It was Aaron Nesmith grabbing the offensive rebound. Definitely going to be giving Nesmith his flowers later in this segment, but then they reset. Tyrese faces the double team. It was great to see his level of aggression over the weekend, sort of returning to that version of himself that we saw during the play-in tournament in the fall, but he makes the right read in this situation as the Knicks send the double team. He finds Nembhard, and again, just an unbelievable shot. And in a vacuum, Knicks fans sort of have to feel like, well, if that's how we're going to lose, then so be it. They played a great game, both of these teams, but if that's the shot that's going to fall, kind of hard to really get mad at that. But the issue is, for the Knicks, the longer this series goes on, the harder it's going to be for them, considering they are juggling all of these different injuries, and there is absolutely a fatigue factor that's setting in, which is what we saw on Sunday afternoon, where they were just wiped off of the floor. And it's in large part, I think, due to the fact that we are definitely seeing tired legs with this Knicks team. Jalen Brunson, who continues to fight through whatever this foot injury is. We've seen him sort of hobbling around at times. It just seemed like on a lot of these layup attempts, we're seeing him finish short and not be able to actually, finish around the rim like he was. I feel like even if you go back to Friday as well, after Nembhard hits that three-pointer to go ahead, on the other end, it seemed like Brunson was sort of trying to let the refs dictate the game a little bit, where he tried to bait the Pacers into a foul on a three-point shot, just ended up in a horrendous miss, and the Pacers were able to close it out from there. Now, if you're Brunson, maybe there's some sort of thought process that the Pacers could potentially be trying to foul. They were up 3, but with just a few seconds left. We have seen this before where obviously other teams, they foul to avoid a three-pointer even being allowed to be made, and the Pacers don't have a great defense, so maybe that was the thought process there, but haven't heard anything from Tibbs or Brunson that was the case. Brunson just sort of owned up to it and said that he needs to be better. It was definitely a disappointing moment for Brunson, who we know how great he is. Don't have to lean on the refs in this situation, but there's also a real chance that there is a fatigue part of it that is set into this because he's been playing 40 minutes per game in these playoffs so far, and at the end of this game, maybe he's just tired, and that is a little bit of the result. Now, Dante DiVincenzo, you got an unbelievable game from him in this situation, so I'm definitely not defending Brunson in this instant. I'm just sort of trying to at least, explain why this could have happened, because it seemed like this was the game where the Knicks were really trying to steal it, take a commanding lead in the series, and be able to at least, I wouldn't say coast, because the Pacers are a team that weren't ever going to go away without a fight, but maybe at least sort of be able to rest their players a little bit more down the stretch of this series. I'm sure that Tibbs does not care whatsoever about what the media is saying in terms of the playing time that he's dishing out in these series, but with all of these injuries catching up to them, it is absolutely a story surrounding the team. And we have seen just the way that, at any given moment in that Game 4 matchup, there was a player on the court for the Knicks who was out of the rotation, essentially, in Game 1, where Alec Burks, who's actually been giving them some decent scoring minutes now, obviously Tibbs knows more about what goes on behind the scenes in that Knicks situation. I have some Knicks fans in my life and said that defensively, Burks was just terrible for the Knicks right after the trade deadline, but he was carrying, I think I touched on this before the weekend as well, that I didn't like how often Burks was being the aggressor when he was playing for the Pistons earlier this year. I thought that he was maybe getting in the way a little bit of the development of some of their younger players, but he was playing pretty well, and the fact that he couldn't give any sort of minutes for this stretch of time, feels like, and, again, Tibbs knows better than anybody, but it feels like an instance where they could have at least played with it a little bit more. Now, granted, Deuce McBride was coming along as well, but this is a team that's been running these 7-man rotations pretty much the entirety of the postseason so far, and now with all of these injuries catching up to them, it's a little bit retroactive, but we're talking about all of these injuries. OG Anunoby has never been a player that has had great durability, and he's playing, again, 40 minutes per game in the postseason. Just not a great sign. The updates also don't seem great for him either. He, of course, we knew he was out for Game 3, knew that he was doubtful for Game 4. He doesn't end up playing, and the fact that we haven't heard any sort of positive update yet is a little bit of a concern for the Knicks, but like I mentioned, to the point of what their rotations look like now, you have Precious Achiuwa starting the game on Saturday and Sunday. Now, minutes-wise, got 22 on Friday, and it was, I believe, 24 on Sunday. Now, granted, blowout game in that one anyways, so it's not like any of the starters got ton of runtime, which I will say I do think was almost better for the Knicks, that if they were going to lose this game, the fact that it was such a, smacking was a good thing for the Knicks, so that Tibbs wasn't going to try and force the issue, play their players those extra minutes. DiVincenzo was the game high for the Knicks. He and actually Deuce McBride as well, both at 32 minutes, but the fact that their players were maybe able to get a little bit more rest and, headed back home into Game 5, where it seems like this is the real turning point for the series. I worry about the Knicks in terms of this series as a whole. I said that I think people are overlooking especially the depth of the Pacers, and we've seen the way that they have been able to apply the pressure on the Knicks, and there have been some instances where they have been able to run the entire court and get some good looks. Josh Hart in particular has been great at that, but at the same time, it's playing into the Pacers, bigger umbrella strategy of trying to wear down the Knicks as they're already playing all of these minutes. And, I feel like at this point, I actually want to look at what the series odds are at this point, because of the fact that I feel like it's probably leaning in favor of the Pacers, the way that the momentum has sort of shifted. Now, I'm definitely not ruling out the Knicks by any means in this situation, but I feel like I always had this kind of gut feeling about the Pacers, and again, definitely cannot overreact to any one game in particular. But yeah, the Pacers have officially taken the series odds at -120. So feel like it's going to be, ultimately for the Knicks here, I think that the reality of the situation is this run has been incredibly fun, but I don't feel like this was the season for them, given all the injuries in the first place. And I keep referencing this, but when they traded for OG Anunoby at the deadline, and I do think that big picture here, Tibbs absolutely does need to consider the usage of him, considering he hasn't been somebody who has been extremely durable, that he is a championship caliber piece, but They need a second scorer, and I know Knicks fans are... I feel like Knicks fans and Julius Randle have a very bipolar relationship where the highs are really good for Julius Randle, but there is also a frustration level with him as well. And, you know, maybe Randle is, in theory, like, he absolutely, and I've had this argument with some of my friends as well, that the Knicks are a better team today with Julius Randle, without a doubt, in my eyes. They need a second scorer, and they've gotten massive production from Dante DiVincenzo and Josh Hart, which is huge for them. But in terms of ball in his hands, is he going to go get a bucket? I think they need Julius Randle. It's very similar to the conversation about the Heat last year in my eyes, where they go on this run without Tyler Hero, and everybody is saying, oh, well, because of the ball movement and, you know, less ball stoppage, that they are better without him. There are aspects of that that could be true, but at the end of the day, the NBA is about scoring, getting buckets, and that's what both Julius Randle and Tyler Hero, to whatever degree, and obviously the extracurriculars with both of them to some degree, are concerns. They're not perfect players, but they would both make their teams better in a playoff series, and I'm not sure how the Knicks are going to choose to operate in this offseason in regards to Julius Randle. I feel like he could potentially be a trade chip to try and get a more legit number two. Now, obviously, there's been some Devin Booker smoke. Donovan Mitchell has been talked about for years now, it seems like. Not totally sure, but I don't think that this was ever really the year for the Knicks to win the finals, but they are continuing to build something up here. They're going to continue to try here, and like I said, I'm absolutely not counting them out in terms of this series against the Pacers, but I never felt great about it, and I think that, again, the fact that the Pacers were able to take both of those games, this is only going to continue to be a harder series for the Knicks as it goes on, and let alone the idea of how that will further impact their postseason run if they were to go on to face the Boston Celtics potentially. But let me know in the comments section what you think about this series, what your expectations are. But we are now going to be taking our second break, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the continued development of Kyrie Irving, the leader of this Dallas Mavericks team, whether he is somebody that there are other teams in the league that could be sort of kicking themselves for not taking a swing at during this past offseason when he was a free agent, as the Dallas Mavericks take a 2-1 series lead over the Oklahoma City Thunder. So stick with us and we will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be talking about the Dallas Mavericks, who took Game 3 against the Oklahoma City Thunder, build up their first series lead against this team, and I was definitely very worried about the Mavericks coming out of Game 1. The injury with Luka continues to still be a concern, and he is dealing with a real injury, and we see him, it seems like 2 to 3 times a game, have some sort of other run-in where it looks like he's not going to get up, but he does continue to do so, and the Mavericks are still rolling. And in large part, as much as Luka absolutely deserves credit for continuing to be the hub of the entire team here, I do think that it is Kyrie Irving that has been the main catalyst for the Mavericks sort of staying alive in this series. Now, I've been giving out tons of Kyrie praise during this series, so I don't want to, stay on it necessarily all too long, but it is this sort of controlled aggression with him where we know at any given point he is going to be able to score. It feels like anytime he plays a first half where he was being a little bit more passive, he is just this, waiting volcano to explode and end up, going on this scoring frenzy. But the continued attention to detail for him of this is the best version of Kyrie I think we've ever seen, and it's because of the teammate that he is, where again, in terms of pure skill, we have seen Kyrie breaking people's ankles and hitting these crazy shots for his entire career, but the advanced maturity with him is just so encouraging to see. And again, I know that a lot of people do sort of tend to go to revisionist history and talk about the fact that Kyrie's always been this. He really hasn't been, though, and there has been a little bit of a question about his buy-in at times, but you can see it with the playmaking, you can see it with the defense, where he is just working so hard at it, game in, game out, and I think that it has possibly even inspired Luka to be better himself on the defensive end. Now, at times still, we know Luka's dealing with this defense. It seems like his lateral movement isn't quite up to speed as much as you would prefer, at least. But I think that Kyrie has been massive for the Mavericks in terms of getting the other players involved as well. We saw another good PJ Washington game, dropping 27 points. I believe that's the same number he had in game 2 as well that we covered last week already. But PJ Washington continuing to be effective for them. And, in this game, as much as it's Kyrie setting up other people, you then have the end of the game where it seemed like they were pretty much toast there, or at least the offensive possession, you could say. There wasn't a chance where it was Jalen Williams, the J-Dub, of course, smothering Kyrie throughout the possession, about 18 seconds, and he ends up getting that running layup to go and end up sending the Thunder home with a loss in this situation. So this has continued to be very impressive for the Mavericks, who I feel like varied on a decent amount. When they made the moves at the trade deadline, a lot of people were scrutinizing them. I thought that baseline, they were going to be a lot of fun to watch, and that they have been, and it's because of these these mid-season additions in PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford. But it seems like the chemistry of this team has just come full circle here, where there were the stories of how the locker room didn't necessarily click with Grant Williams, and now you have somebody in PJ Washington who seems like he can kind of make some moves off of the dribble himself. And I feel like for Washington, what he kind of reminds me of, not from a play style perspective necessarily, but in terms of the situation that he sort of came into the NBA with, is it reminds me slightly of Aaron Gordon. When he came into the league, he was drafted by the Orlando Magic, and at that point, the Magic just really had nothing going for them as an organization in terms of postseason hopes. And Gordon, he was this player that showed flashes. He, of course, was in the dunk contest, so people knew the name and knew that he had some promise, but there was just a level that he clearly wasn't going to reach in terms of being the alpha on a contending team. And PJ Washington, it feels like a little bit, was in that same boat, where he was a late lottery pick when he was drafted, went to a high-profile school in Kentucky, and Charlotte was just a little bit messy, and it seemed like there were opportunities for him to fully take over, but instead he was just a solid player that maybe let down in terms of people setting high expectations for him, and now he is in a competitive environment where he can be his talents are being put to use in terms of being a role player, if you want to call it that, and he is executing at an extremely high rate. The three-point shot for him has been a massive development, and I've said this all year. I don't think that there's anybody who gets the ball with 2 seconds on the shot clock more than PJ Washington, but he just continues to fire. There's no hesitation with him, where we've seen a little bit of hesitation with some of their other players that I do think can be a little bit concerning. Derrick Jones Jr., for as impactful as he is on the defensive end, seems like sometimes he gets a little bit gun shy. You could say a similar thing for Josh Green as well, and I love the minutes that they provide because of the energy, but PJ Washington just does not let himself get down in these instances. He understands the role. You play great defense. When you have to, you can take things off of the dribble. He's been big for them rebounding as well. I think he had 11 in game 2, something along those lines. And then in this instance, you stand in the corner, you wait for Kyrie and Luka to pass you the ball, you fire away. That's just, it is the understanding. I just mentioned Grant Williams earlier. He talked about how difficult it is to be one of those other players in that system and just sort of sit around waiting for your shot. But it seems like PJ Washington has just embraced it, and we're seeing an awesome version of him, and it is really encouraging to see. Now, I guess last thing I'll say before I move on to the Thunder in this instance, the center minutes have been pretty interesting, where we saw the whole Hacka Lively situation late in the fourth quarter of this game. Chet Holmgren is trying to chase Lively down. It's just these 2 7-footers basically playing tag, it looks like, where Lively's running out of bounds and running all around the court. And it was just a very funny sort of visual to see. But, I do think that Lively has sort of almost earned the respect of the Thunder in some way, that they are trying to scare him out of the game essentially by giving him these intentional fouls, putting him on the spot. And he did pretty well for himself by the end of that, where I think he missed 3 of his first 4 in these Hacka Lively situations, but he ended up finishing the game 8 of 12 from that free throw line. And his continued development, I don't know if I was necessarily fully familiar with his game in Duke when he was playing at Duke like this. He was absolutely hurt by the fact that there wasn't the level of spacing that obviously we now see in the NBA, and the way that he can sort of play into this system just a lot smoother, and it's making for some great performances from him. So you have to appreciate that. But on the Thunder side of this, the youth is definitely catching up to them to some degree. We are continuing to see these Josh Giddey minutes dip and dip as the games go on. Played just 13 minutes in this game. Going to be really interesting to see what they do with him in the offseason, because with all of the assets that they have in terms of draft capital, and even with some young players as well, feels like you have to upgrade that final spot. And, for the Thunder, he could potentially, I guess, be, more of a... Because we saw him earlier in the year when some of the other starters were missing. He was able to find his game a little bit more. I don't think that he is necessarily just fully washed out now. But in this Thunder system, especially when it comes to these playoff minutes, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander just played 42 minutes on Saturday when these teams faced off. There's no need for a backup point guard to the, if you want to call it pedigree, former number 6 overall pick and somebody who showed tons of promise in his rookie season. So I feel like they just need to find a better option for him in that starting lineup. They've run a couple different options here. We've seen Cason Wallace play some of these big-time fourth quarter minutes in place of him. It was Aaron Wiggins, I believe, in Game 2 that got the call. Isaiah Joe, it seems like some of the minutes that he gives are their most impactful. So they're trying a bunch of different things here. in terms of figuring out who to actually play at that Giddey position. But I would expect this is going to be his last season with the Thunder, but let me know in the comments section if there is a specific team. I mean, I'm just sort of saying this as I'm thinking it out. I feel like wouldn't necessarily be a horrible fit in terms of being a playmaker, not having to take on much of a scoring role, but setting others up. If you were to go to San Antonio, Devin Vassell, his ability to play sort of off of the ball and being a great catch and shooter hasn't been utilized because of the fact that there hasn't been a traditional point guard. Wemby, of course, they need to actually get him a playmaker. Now, again, going to talk more about the draft lottery tomorrow, but they get the 4th and 8th overall picks in this upcoming draft, so maybe they can find an option there. But Giddey might be somebody rolling the dice on too as well. But as for the rest of the Thunder here, Jalen Williams, J-Dub, is definitely dealing with some type of injury, but his game hasn't necessarily translated to the postseason quite in the way that we wanted to. Now, he was a most improved player, at least candidate, and he showed that he can definitely be a top 25 player in the league, but he is struggling a little bit as things currently stand. It's not even like he had a bad game necessarily, but in terms of, fact that he was scoring 20 plus points a game and being this go-to guy for them, just doesn't seem like he's at that same level. Now, again, he was dealing with some sort of foot ankle injury, kept him out for the majority of the third quarter and some of the fourth as well. So injuries, obviously, everybody's dealing with something at this point. Nobody is fully healthy that's actually getting playing time in the postseason. I think that, I'm going to stick with my pick of the Thunder because of the fact that I'm just not really trying to waver like that. But the Mavericks are in a very good position. They're going to be facing off against the Thunder tonight at 9:30 Eastern with a chance to really take a commanding lead here. I think the Thunder have a good chance to bounce back, but let me know what you think in the comments section. For now, though, we are going to be taking our third break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, want to dive into the Boston Celtics, the conversation surrounding Jason Tatum after finally putting together a more, scoring first game. Has he answered the questions about the doubts surrounding the Celtics team? We're going to be answering that, but first, a quick break, so stick with us. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Coming back here on the GSMC Sports Podcast, now I want to talk about the Boston Celtics, who took Game 3 to be able to retake the series lead. I feel like a lot of people, for the most part, aren't necessarily thinking that the Celtics... I don't know. We of course have Garrison, who joined us on the podcast last week, said that Cleveland could make a little bit of a sneaky run here at the Celtics. I feel like for the most part, though, the consensus is that the Celtics should be able to take care of business in this series. The sportsbooks definitely back that idea up. On DraftKings right now, the Celtics are minus 8,000 favorites. Now, that being said, I would not be shocked if the Cavaliers were able to take another game out of this series. I had Celtics in 5 coming into this, but this Cavaliers team, I do think, is a little bit better than I gave them credit for, and I think that maybe to some degree as well, the Celtics are missing Porzingis a little bit more than I was expecting, going out there and running Al Horford 39 minutes at his age. I love Al Horford as a Celtics fan from the bottom of my heart, but it was a little bit painful at some points during Saturday's game, where it was just clear that at this point in his career, he is not able to necessarily keep up, and the fact that he's running around so much, especially on defense. Donovan Mitchell is going out of his way to get these matchups against Horford, get him switched onto. That's where a handful of Mitchell's three-point barrage came from, where he was just incredible. Once again, Mitchell is, but it's really to no surprise. We're just used to this at this point. But then it seemed like almost the fatigue of that defensive side alone sort of led to tired arms, tired legs on the offensive side, where he's standing at the three-point line, but Evan Mobley isn't even respecting his shot. He's camped out in the post and just making life incredibly difficult for any Celtics players that are trying to drive at the rim. And Al got some, looks on the outside, but 0 of 6 from 3, 1 of 7 from the field as a whole. And again, Horford is a great backup big and a true veteran for this team. But in general, we are seeing that this team cannot win a championship in my eyes without Kristaps Porzingis. And that is not necessarily, the Celtics are still an incredibly talented team, and because of that, they should have relatively little problems closing out Cleveland here. And I think that even with all the injuries the Knicks are dealing with now, sort of selfishly, I would love to see the Porzingis versus Knicks playoff atmosphere. I feel like that would be something that would be very charged up and just very funny to see. Knicks fans always had a little bit of a contentious relationship with Porzingis, but also loved him at a certain point as well. So I feel like that would be really good viewing there. But, I do think the Celtics, because of all the injuries the Knicks are dealing with, would be able to make it to the finals even without Porzingis. Now, there have been some reports that the Cavs and Celtics both may be expecting to see Porzingis. I believe he returned to, I believe the clip that I saw was from this morning, that he has returned to on-court exercises with the Celtics, so it could be sooner rather than later that we see him, but I'm sure the Celtics are also not going to rush him back whatsoever. But ultimately here for the Celtics, in terms of have they answered the questions in terms of the concern, I don't know if they necessarily have. It might just also be the reality of the situation, where as much as it's great seeing Jason Tatum score 33 points and, look to play a better offensive game. Now, the three-point shooting, I'll still never get over it necessarily in terms of his love for those step-back shots and the fallaways that he takes in the mid-range. Shot selection is still very much a conversation with him, but I also don't think that they need him to go out and do what Jalen Brunson or Anthony Edwards or Shai Gilgeous-Alexander have done, where they have this really good team. And again, the comments, I talked about this last week, the comments he made after game 2 talking about, how can we be a super team if we don't win any awards, just felt like a very strange comment to make, and almost disappointing, I would argue as well. The fact that that's his concerns is awards after they looked terrible in a loss to a team that they absolutely should have beaten at home. They're 500 in the postseason over the past couple of years. It was definitely the wrong time if you're Tatum in that situation. But again, ultimately, I don't think that Tatum does need to go out and score 30 points per game. He's doing a great job still defensively. He is far and away their best rebounder, and you can see that there's a legitimate drive for him to do so, especially considering the fact that there is no Porzingis, who, even when he's in, isn't necessarily an elite rebounder, but Al Horford is the one sort of playing the 5 for them, and he's just not going to be able to match up to some of these taller opponents, and specifically Evan Mobley, who sort of, if we want to shift over to the Cavaliers side of this briefly, Mobley is somebody that just really, I don't know how to feel about him fully, because I do really believe in him, the player, but it's at this point, it is a little bit of a question of what direction is he going to go here. Is he going to develop into the paint presence that it seemed like he could have a little bit of an interior force to him, but he gets out physicaled a lot, it feels like, and that is something that we're definitely seeing in this Celtics series, where Al, for as much smaller as he is, I believe it was against Al Horford, but he's trying to back him down and just moving absolutely nowhere, and ends up getting called for an offensive 3-second violation because he had nowhere to go, because he was unable to move his defender. And so it's that, or if you're not going to be that, because we already know he has the defense on locks, which is, even still, it feels like at times, I mean, we saw Drew Holiday sort of definitely bounce back in a big way in this game, and a lot of what he was doing was actually attacking Mobley on these drives in the paint. So that was at least, notable. Now, Mobley can't do everything from a defensive perspective, as much as we have to give all the flowers to Donovan Mitchell for the offensive performance. Defensively, he is definitely, and he has to carry a very large load offensively right now, but defensively, he absolutely gets taken advantage of. At least he currently is. Now, call it fatigue, call it a skill issue, you tell me, but one way or another, he hasn't been great, and it's not like Darius Garland is much better from that same perspective, where he once again has another little bit of an underwhelming performance. But I want to finish on Mobley because, again, my point is I want to either see him become that inside guy, the Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan. I'm not saying quite to the careers of that, but having that two-way ability of being able to make opponents feel you on the inside in the paint, or to be able to stretch it out with a three-point shot. He's at least sort of flirted with the idea of trying to expand his range. It just hasn't necessarily worked up to this point. But like I mentioned, Garland, again, another pretty disappointing performance from him. 6 of 15 from the field, 1 of 6 from 3. There would definitely be real, and I've been talking about this since even before the season started, that the Cavaliers were eventually going to need to make some type of a move in terms of shaking up their roster between the Mitchell and Garland combo and the Allen and Mobley combo, and it seems like they're going to have to pick 2 of those players moving forward. But if it weren't for the fact that there was so much speculation about the idea of whether or not Donovan Mitchell would be willing to re-sign in Cleveland, Darius Garland would be in trade rumors, I think, just as much as I was sort of referring to with Josh Giddey earlier in the show, where I just feel like, this has been a disappointing look for him. Now, we know that there is plenty of potential with him. We've seen him on an all-star team, and there is something there, but maybe it's playing off ball as much as he is because Donovan Mitchell is having to carry the load. I'm not sure, but Cavaliers definitely have some moves to make in the offseason before they can be considered a true finals contender, at least in my eyes. Now, we'll see how the rest of this postseason plays out. Celtics right now on ESPN Bet are 8.5-point favorites. That's the thing with the Celtics, is they are overvalued every single time in every game, not just postseason games, where it's almost impossible to bet on the Celtics because of the fact that they get so much credit from Vegas and such, that I wouldn't be shocked if the Cavaliers were able to pull off the win tonight. Now, I just think that the Celtics are, top to bottom, a better team than the Cavaliers, so I'm not going to pick against them. I'm just saying there is a level of, maybe it's even the immaturity of the Celtics as well, not being able to close this out. But if I'm the Celtics, I'm trying to end this series ASAP and move on. But let me know what your thoughts are. We're going to be taking our final break here. Done a lot of basketball today, and I want to sort of switch gears a little bit. Had a pretty exciting MLB debut with Paul Skenes over the weekend, so I want to dive into that. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day. And like I mentioned ahead of the break, I want to talk about the exciting debut of Paul Skenes, pitcher for the Pirates. This was one of the most highly anticipated pitcher's debuts. A lot of people are comparing it to Steven Strasburg, which was in 2010. So really of the past decade, this is the name that the most people have been interested in from a pitching prospect perspective. And it is sort of, I know that he's going to be getting compared a lot to Strasburg. And, you know, if you look at the lines of these debuts, it is not the same, but it's also a different MLB that we are seeing today than we were in 2010, where especially being surrounded with all of these pitching injuries, teams are trying to be more cautious of bringing in these younger talents. And that's what the Pirates sort of did in this instance, where Strasburg, he threw 90 plus pitches in his debut, and he was tremendous in doing so. 7 innings pitched, 14 strikeouts, 0 walks, 2 earned runs for Strasburg. For Skenes, his stat line wasn't quite as impressive from that same perspective, but he showed a lot of promise in this game where faced off against that Cubs lineup on Saturday. He finishes 4 innings pitched, 7 strikeouts, 2 walks, 3 earned runs. Now, he was taken deep by Nico Horner in the 4th inning for the first run, and then the rest of his runs came from that disastrous Pittsburgh 5th inning, where he did allow back-to-back hits in to open that inning up. They end up pulling him, finish his day at 84 pitches. Now, this was, definitely not super substantial in terms of the longevity of his outing. He dealt with a pretty jam-packed 2nd inning where he worked his way out of a bases-loaded jam, but that was with 23 pitches, so definitely took a toll on him physically there. But we saw Skenes end up getting pulled in the 5th inning, and then, like I mentioned, just a disastrous bullpen inning where it was Kyle Nicholas striking out the first 2 batters and then proceeding to walk 4 consecutive batters, scoring 3 runs. That's where Skenes' other 2 earned runs came from. But the walks didn't stop there, as Fleming and Holderman went on to walk in another 3 runs. There was a rain delay in between all of this madness, so ultimately the Pirates bullpen walks in 6 total runs in the 5th inning. First time a team has walked in that many runs in 1 inning since 1959. So for Skenes, doesn't get the win, ends up with a no decision and a line that is tainted a little bit. But again, it's not necessarily, especially when you are Pittsburgh, where despite another promising start, doesn't seem like this is going to be a postseason year for them. Now, don't fully rule them out, but they are 18-22 as of Saturday, where they did actually win that game thanks to some home runs after that 5th inning. It was Yasmani Grandal and Andrew McCutchen that put them up. So they do end up actually winning that game, but 18-23 is where they currently sit. And it's not about the wins and losses, not that that's ever really a pitcher stat, but for Skenes, he at least showed the type of stuff that he has, where 17 of his 84 pitches were at least 100 miles per hour. 6 of them hit 101. We saw this in college when he was at LSU, and we did also see him, for better or for worse, that in college he was grinding out these complete games, had no fear whatsoever, was going deep into them, and helped LSU end up winning the national championship in his final year in college. But, again, he had a couple of really nice strikeouts on some sliders as well. So again, the potential is absolutely there with Skenes, and it should be really exciting to continue to watch him develop. I feel like that whole class, the top 3 of him, Wyatt Langford, who Langford's been a little bit more quiet than we were expecting, but also with him, he has all the physical tools, and I think that he is going to continue to be a star as well. And then his former Tiger, Paul Skenes, that is his former Tiger as well, in Dylan Cruz. I believe Dylan is the first name, but Dylan Cruz, who was the outfield prospect, he was also absolutely electric in college. He was drafted to the Nationals, and I'm sure he will make his way up to the majors, some point soon. But it's just an exciting time to be a Pirates fan in general. I know that, like I sort of alluded to earlier, it was another sort of letdown after a hot start. Now, plenty of season left to play here, but they started 10-4 this year after dropping however many it was over the next stretch, going 8-19 since then. Last year they were 20-8 through their first 28 games, finished 76-86. But at least not just Skenes himself, but the fact that he is going to be developing alongside Jared Jones, who has been a massive development for them. He's also in his rookie season. Through 8 games, he has a 2.68 ERA, a .872 whip, which is tremendous, a 10.7 strikeouts per 9. FIP is a little high at 3.48, but Jones, another player where it seems like there is a real 1 and 2 potential here, frontline starters, and continuing to build this up and having a real building block should be a lot of fun to watch for them. Now, unfortunately, the reason why they are not having the season that it was maybe seeming like they could have is because of the fact that their offense just has not been producing quite at the level they were hoping at. And they don't really have, I know that O'Neal Cruz is, a fun prospect, definitely, with the athletic tools that he has. And I'm sure if you have any sort of following of baseball and you are on social media, you've seen the clips of his fielding where he is just absolutely firing bullets from the third base to first, in terms of the athletic talent that he has. But Pirates are bottom third in the MLB in the majority of scoring and batting statistics, where they're 27th in runs, home runs. They are towards the bottom as well, so they haven't necessarily rounded out their team necessarily. Now, they have some names, absolutely, like I just mentioned, Yasmani Grandal and Andrew McCutchen sort of firing in those final runs for Pittsburgh on Saturday. Those are definitely names, but in terms of the up-and-coming prospect, it does seem like they are a little bit ways away there. But, I do believe that they are playing in a division that over the next handful of years could be very much open in that NL Central. Right now, the Brewers, the way that their offense is performing is really sort of leading them to the place that they're at. Cubs have some promise too, and it's the young prospects that the Reds have, specifically more so from the batting side than from the pitcher side, that, they can absolutely be good. But I do believe that this division can be open, and it's just going to take maybe investing a little bit more into the offense, where they just need more production, and they don't really have a go-to power hitter. They are bottom of the league in home runs as well. I think that's a huge part of it. O'Neal Cruz has hit 7 so far up to this point in the season, so that is a positive for them. Again, I think that he does have very much a bright future in the MLB ahead, but ultimately here they're going to need a more well-rounded offense from that entire perspective. But again, a very nice debut for Skenes in terms of, again, showing the type of stuff that he has. Results are sort of ultimately whatever. It's a long season. Doesn't really matter what the wins and losses are. And again, they ended up winning this game anyways in spite of their pitching. So you can't even necessarily hold that over Skenes. But again, it's the stuff that he has that can be so dynamic. Again, I think you're looking at probably placement and control and some of those off-speed pitches as well. But Skenes has been very successful over the past, call it 2 years from LSU, did really well in the minors as well, and now he's here. And the fact that he has, again, a little bit of a running mate alongside him in Jared Jones, think that the Pirates are going to more and more be, I wouldn't say must-watch necessarily, but it's fun when the Pirates are good. I've always sort of said this, that I don't know what it is about that franchise, but you kind of inherently, at least myself, who doesn't root for a team in the NL, I'm sure that if you do, you probably feel slightly differently about it. But definitely a team that you can feel good about, sort of the unproven of the Pirates, and finding their way back to prominence is something that I am hopefully looking forward to. But let me know what you thought in the comments section. That is all we have time for today, though. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We run every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern, so be sure to check us out. Like, follow, subscribe. Check us out on social media as well, where you can catch more of our exclusive content. But as for today, that is all we have. Take care, and we will see you tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.